Okay, so thinking about how can we manage climate change, the impacts of climate change, how to reduce kind of climate change. All these reasons can fall under mitigation. Mitigation, kind of this idea that you want to reduce the severity of something. Can't get rid of it completely, but we can actually move forward in doing things in a much better way. So almost investing more into alternative energy sources. So for example, renewable energy. So we looked at exactly the Hinkley Point, or the UK is spending a bit of money in building a nuclear reactor. Now this idea that actually moving away from fossil fuels is a much more better step. Obviously these renewables, what's it called, you could say that don't produce as much CO2, very little CO2, obviously reducing ultimately the carbon footprint. That's the kind of area you'd want to mention. Here we've got this idea, the Hinkley Point can produce about 7% of electricity for the UK. Right, another method around mitigation of managing climate change is carbon capture and storage, CCS. Okay, so this is really highly advanced technology that some companies can adopt to use, or if they can afford it, really. And now, if you look at this diagram, it's literally capturing, let's say, carbon emissions using technology kind of filters, and then eventually transporting it through pipeline and then storing it deep underground in some form of injection well. So it's just storing it literally underground, so taking it from the atmosphere almost and then storing it underground. It is quite effective in terms of it can capture up to 90% of gas. Again, it's using this high level technology to suppress the gas, then store it under kind of, let's say, underground. And it's a key thing that could be really used in the future a lot more to kind of, like, let's say, help a lot of countries reduce their kind of almost carbon footprint. This one's a very easy one to talk about in terms of, let's say, planting trees is one of the main things many countries do all around the world to become carbon neutral. Again, remember this idea of, trees are carbon sinks. They absorb, let's say, carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis. Now, you could also argue that actually trees release moisture through transpiration, and that can eventually obviously allow cloud cover to form, which will result in kind of, let's say, a reduced amount of, let's say, sun's rays, causing the kind of the world to kind of increase in temperature. So planting trees is also a very good example of, let's say, reducing climate change. Lastly, probably the most important one, international agreements. Okay, so the international agreements is literally countries from all around the world, their leaders come together, and they did here in Paris in 2015. And what they did was they put money together, but it's more than just money, it's agreements that actually, look, let's come together and let's deal with this issue about climate change. So what happened is actually they set this goal, which was to make sure that we as a world do not go over that kind of 2 degrees increase in global temperatures. Now, how could we do that? Let's put money into projects and ideas and commitments, really, to cut out greenhouse gas emissions. So like some countries will say that by 2030 or 2040 we're going to stop, let's say, using fossil fuels and stuff like that. Like Paris, for example, sorry, not Paris, France, where Paris is, they said that they're going to ban petrol and diesel cars by 2040. So it's these promises to ensure that we live in a world that is sustainable. Now, they also put 100 billion towards, let's say, a certain project. The 2015 agreement led to 100 billion going to climate change projects, for example, helping more vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, because they are obviously more, let's say, susceptible to kind of like face the issues of rising sea levels. However, you could disagree and argue that there are some issues with, let's say, the Paris Agreement and generally these international agreements. You could argue that they're non-binding, meaning there isn't actually any consequence if no one, let's say, doesn't actually follow and stick to their promises. Like if someone doesn't stick to a promise of the agreement, nothing's going to actually happen to them. You could argue that Donald Trump in 2017 left, let's say, this kind of idea of the believing in climate change. He didn't believe in climate change and pulled out America from this agreement. Again, yeah, there's you could argue that it's only promises, no real action. So we're not going to really tackle the problem, are we? So the last lesson, which is around adaptation, so not mitigation anymore. Can people adapt around the world? If the world's getting warmer and we're going to see kind of more, let's say, issues like, let's say, extreme weather events. So there is these ideas, and we could look at, let's say, changes in agriculture systems. If people are struggling around farming around the world, could we show them techniques and strategies to help ensure that they are not too fallen behind. Okay, so again, many parts of Africa are going to struggle, especially the southern half, because of, let's say, changes in rainfall and obviously more increased temperature. Right, let's have a quick look in terms of the actual techniques. So farming adaptations. So we looked at the Gambia, specifically in West Africa. What were farmers actually taught? So, they were educated techniques. Now, you got to know these techniques. You could argue them in your exam. You could say that farmers were taught quite a few things. They were introduced these drought-resistant crops where they kind of had obviously longer roots. These crops obviously provided, let's say, farmed goods where for them to survive and for cattle and for grazing. But these drought resistant crops were able to survive longer without water, so that is one really good effective technique. You could also argue that actually there were also these shade trees that were provided. Now, what's so good about shade trees? Now, obviously with longer branches and, let's say, more vegetation amongst these trees, they were again very drought resistant, but also were able to protect other, let's say, plants from strong sunshine. So that was its huge benefit. Again, they were taught irrigation techniques, so not to use too much water, or even certain methods and equipment to ensure that actually little amount of water is used. So actually that leaves them with a bit more water. So again, using controlled amounts of water. So that is teaching them techniques. Look at drip irrigation. So thinking about what drip irrigation is this kind of system of technology where actually it's a very slow drip system of where things are still being watered, but not like from a ridiculous amount, because they don't have that kind of water to use spare to their luxury. It's again drip irrigation, slow amount of water being dripped into roots, allowing them to survive. So, remembering what this was, managing water supply in the Himalayas. Okay, so in Nepal in particular, water supply is an issue. Naturally, that area would get water supply through glacial melt, natural glacial melt. But because of climate change, we're seeing, glaciers being melting much more quicker. And in this summer, spring, a lot of areas struggle without water. And that obviously impacts, let's say, farmers and just general livelihoods. So this was the artificial glacier project. So they've made this themselves, the people in this region, with climate engineers. Now this project was really vital, but let's look at how they made it and how this was important. So this whole area obviously depended on glacial melt. Because they were receding so quickly, they need to come up with this idea. So thinking about that, that image we just saw, that actual kind of artificial, let's say, cone of ice was made by them collecting the water and freezing it in winter, because they know they'll need it in the summer. So obviously when it melted in the summer, they had a vast amount of water supply. And again, this was essential for a lot of farmers. And if there was a water shortage, we call them ice stupors. So again, it's northern India in the area of Ladakh. You don't need to know it specifically like that. And it stayed frozen throughout winter, melted in the spring, really showing how areas, people as well, have adapted to, let's say, the changing environment. Lastly, you can talk about how people are adapting to rising sea levels. So we looked at Maldives specifically, and how the small islands of the Maldives are trying to tackle this issue by adapting to climate change. Okay, so first of all, they restored coastal mangroves, these kind of like woody creeper-like trees along the coast. Now, these trees had, they've got tangled roots, and it just prevents, let's say, the soil being washed away, and it holds back. It's really effective in holding back, let's say, rising sea levels from entering the land. You obviously got houses that being built on stilts, so kind of higher above the ground. Even if waters were to rise, it wouldn't really cause huge amount of damage or loss of life. Again, what else was there? There were other examples that they did in terms of what happened. They obviously built sea walls. That's the most easiest thing to talk about. They could, adapt by building sea walls, ensuring that actually water levels do not kind of, let's say, go overboard. And then we've got actually some areas where they're building artificial islands that are much higher to ensure if anyone does need to relocate, that they have these measures ready. So this is everything that is pretty much on the climate change unit. Obviously, you will have to go over your own notes, and there's not loads of questions on climate change, but there could be a few this year.